Shwmae a chroeso I Sgwrs, podlediad Consortiwm Canolbarth y De. Yn y podlediad hwn byddwch chi'n clywed y trafodaethau diweddara am bob math o bethau addysg. Hello and welcome to Sgwrs, the Central South Consortium podcast. In this podcast we'll bring you the very latest discussions on all things education.
Welcome to the latest in our LLC series of podcasts on Sgwrs. And in this particular session, we're going to be talking about some of the huge opportunities that the establishment of LLC, languages, literacy and communication brings as an AoLE. We appreciate that in many ways it's quite difficult to exploit some of those opportunities in secondary schools because traditionally there's a structurally sort of disciplinary approach. So we teach in different subjects and different departments. And there are obviously logistical issues around meeting between languages, English and Cymraeg teams. However, our conversation today is very much around the opportunities that LLC brings, and in particular around the teaching of vocabulary, as it is at the heart of anything to do with languages, but in particular languages that are acquired primarily in the classroom. So if we're talking about an English medium school, Cymraeg is largely a language which is taught and acquired in the classroom. So therefore, teaching vocab explicitly is really integral to acquisition of Cymraeg, as it is for French, German, Italian, Spanish, and other home languages that we would love to see shared in the LLC classroom. So in that spirit of exploration, we're bringing together Amanda Matthias from the Cymraeg in English Medium LLC team and Jasmine Walsh, who is the literacy coordinator at St Richard Gwyn High School in the Vale of Glamorgan. So that gives us, I think, two very different perspectives on vocab teaching in English medium schools, and we'd like to explore what the commonalities are. So first of all, Amanda, if I can ask you, with your experience in supporting Welsh and English medium schools, and a lot of that being supporting primary schools, what would some of your key messages be around vocab teaching?
Well, I think the key message for me is that you need to drill effectively in the classroom in order for a language lesson to be effective. So what we tend to do in Welsh, Welsh and English medium schools, Cymraeg in English medium schools, is that we tend to look very much at vocabulary and language patterns together. So really the definition of the drilling is that you're kind of the children are imitating what you're saying and repeating what you're saying. So the learners are developing these listening skills. They're building confidence to use vocabulary and language patterns orally by listening really carefully to pronunciation and repeating several times. Now, there are different methods of drilling, and these are very dependent on the age and stage of development of the learners.
Lovely. Can I just bring in Jasmine there actually quickly, because I'm really interested in the point you're making there, Amanda, about the role of the teacher, particularly as a role model, so that they're giving effective role modelling of pronunciation. Can you see any crossovers there, Jasmine, with your context as a literacy coordinator? What do you see in terms of the role of the teacher there?
Yes, absolutely, Andy. I think that modelling and, teachers explicitly modelling vocabulary and sentence patterns, like Amanda said, is really key sort of across the curriculum. And I suppose in some ways teaching tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary across the curriculum is almost a little bit like teaching a second language, because potentially those are speech patterns and vocabulary that aren't used at home or aren't used very frequently. So I think teaching academic language, is very similar perhaps to teaching a second language and explicitly modelling those sentence frames for academic talk. for class discussions, things like constantly modeling, I agree, and the idea of is especially important because, and sort of getting them to use these sort of academic sentence frames, as well as teaching the vocabulary, I think is key. So I think there's a lot of crossover there.
Fabulous, interesting. At the moment, we're supporting a few clusters who are looking at Oracy specifically, and those conversations around sentence frames and modelling the right tone as well as the right vocab is quite interesting when you're looking at the connections between vocab and Oracy. Lovely. So obviously it's key. We're in agreement there, but in terms of classroom management of teaching of vocab, Amanda, how would you go about that? How do you make vocab teaching engaging and also manageable?
Well, I think knowing some strategies and techniques for drilling is vital, but also being creative and innovative, really, because what we want is the learners to internalise the language, so it becomes quite a natural working language in the classroom. So I would say drilling should be short and pacey. There should be a rhythm to it. And we need to praise the learners as well, so that we're building up their confidence every time. Fun activities and language games are also really useful for engaging learners. And there is a resource within the CSC Knowledge Bank website, if you go into Welsh and Bilingualism, and it's called Llyfr Gamer Iaith. You'll find it in the Help Ahead folder. And this is like a Welsh language games book. So that's really useful if you're thinking that you would like some ideas of language games. But consider things as well, like, questionnaires, battleships, dice games, partner games, group games, matching question and answer games, and hot seating, trying to get the children out of their seats and getting them moving, I think also helps a lot.
That's interesting as well. I don't know if you want to come in there, Jasmine, too, because I know we've had some conversations around the role of gesture and some of the power of using gesture and actions associated with vocab.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of I think a lot of people are starting to use things like images now when they're teaching vocabulary and pairing a common image. Gestures is brilliant. I really, really like that idea, Amanda. I think, having a sort of a gesture or even perhaps a facial expression and a tone of voice when you're delivering those words to really help make that knowledge sticky. And I'd like to pick up, if I can, actually, on what you said right at the beginning there about that idea of repetition to internalize the language. I think, if we want our learners to move towards word ownership, the studies show, don't they, that they need to have heard the word something like 10 to 15 times or used it or applied it about 10 to 15 times and sometimes more, actually, for perhaps our lower prior attaining pupils. So that repetition, I think, is something that we also share, that sort of retrieval practice, repetition over time, so that they can really embed the new vocabulary and the new knowledge.
And very often sort of new vocabulary, if we're thinking about exam contexts, and particularly sort of literature, very often new vocab that needs to be internalised and owned, as you say, Jasmine, might take the form of kind of quotations. And I think it's really interesting that some of the same techniques that really are bread and butter in the international languages or the Cymraeg classroom actually have some really, really powerful applications in the first language, in the English and the English literature classroom as well, where we really see that ownership of quotations can really boost learner confidence, can really boost sort of self-esteem and engagement with text. So I think the crossovers are there. We don't always look across the different language streams in LLC, though. I don't know if either of you had any thoughts about that.
No, I agree. Quite early on in my career, I was fortunate enough to go on a pupil trail, and I did watch a Cymraeg lesson. and watching that process of drilling, and the teacher, the sort of call and response, the teacher modelling the vocabulary and the sentences, and the pupils echoing it back. That was really powerful, and something that I began to use in my classroom for vocabulary. But Andy, I think, using it for things like quotations and other knowledge, I think we can learn a lot, like you say, from our colleagues in Cymraeg and international languages about how to improve sort of storage and retrieval.
Yes, I agree. It would be really interesting to actually see some of the work that's going on in literacy classes. I've been to schools where they have shown me some of the resources and some of the work that they're doing in English, and it marries so much and fits in so much with what we're doing in Welsh. And in fact, I've kind of tried as much as I can to show commonalities when I do model lessons within schools, just to make schools aware of, oh yes, this can work in both languages.
That's lovely. One thing I'd like to explore as well is the idea of sort of ratio, because obviously for learners to have that ownership that we've talked about, and to feel sort of empowered and to have that repeated exposure to new vocab, we do want them to be using it themselves, not just perhaps listening to one or two members of the class using it or being challenged on it. So what approaches do you have to kind of build ratio in the classroom where we're introducing new vocab, or perhaps, Amanda, in the context of some of those games that you talked about?
Well, my philosophy is everybody speaks Welsh. So whatever activities you do, we want everyone engaged, everyone involved. So when I'm doing drilling, I would practice it as a class to begin with. So the learners will repeat the key vocabulary and language patterns as a chorus after the teacher. And then you can divide the class into two and almost orchestrate the drilling. Oh, this side, then this side, both sides together. Then you could even refine it to, we'll look at groups. We'll look at rows and individuals to repeat the actual language patterns or vocabulary. When it comes to individuals, however, I would always start with the strongest individuals to actually repeat the patterns back, because they're more confident, and the less confident pupils will just hear it several times before it's their turn, and that will build up their confidence. So that would be my approach in terms of ratios.
So really kind of building on the receptive language first of all, and also I suppose it links to that idea of having good role models, doesn't it, as well? Talking about starting with perhaps some of the more confident or stronger students at that point, because as you say, we want to encode the correct version, don't we? We want to encode the correct pronunciation rather than sort of encoding anything wrong and teaching it wrongly from the beginning. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Did you want to? Was there any applications or any tips, Jasmine, from an English point of view around building ratio? I'm just wondering whether it fits in with anything that we talked about with quotation learning or explicit teaching of vocab. Are there any models that you've used where you kind of feel there's high levels of engagement?
Yeah, possibly. So it's really interesting actually considering ratio and taking some tips, I think, for myself there from Amanda about how many learners can be involved at one time. There is a strategy from Voice 21, they call it the traverse. So you have pupils lined up in two rows facing each other, and with that partner then that they're opposite, they could practice a particular a conversation, or they could ask a question, or they could be tasked with using new vocabulary in a conversation, or whatever the task is. But the idea is then that every few minutes the traverse moves, so the teacher moves them along, so pupils experience the exact same task or conversation with 3 or 4 or even 5 different partners. And I think that sort of picks up on what Amanda was saying there about the modelling and using your really sort of strong pupils as good models. If some of those perhaps less confident or less able learners have already engaged in this particular conversation with a really strong peer, when they move on to their next partner, they can sort of mirror and take some of what they heard in the previous conversation, without that sort of whole class threatening environment where, oh, it sounds like I've just copied what somebody else said, because it's a new partner, it's a new chance. And if they go on to repeat that themselves then 3 or 4 times, all right, it might not have been their original thought to begin with, but by this point they've probably internalized that, and they've probably taken that knowledge away from that lesson and that activity.
Fabulous, yeah, great. So really nice link between good oracy practice then and introduction of vocabulary, and we know that it's the most sort of accessible way of introducing new vocab initially through conversation, through oral practice.
I think, using songs as well with younger pupils is really useful, because there's plenty of repetitive vocabulary there. So that will support their language acquisition, and rhythm is really useful in drilling vocabulary. So if you chunk up a word and add a tune, such as the Welsh word for computer, which is cyfrifiadur, well, that's quite a difficult word for pupils to say. So cyfrifiadur, bum bum. And so you sing it a few times and they get used to it. But we have lots of songs in Welsh, particularly for the younger children, songs to do with the weather and so on, which have a lot of repetitive, not just vocabulary, but language patterns to help them retain it. I also find that, certain methods, such as we talked about gestures, didn't we? The fact that if we add a gesture to a language pattern or a word, pupils tend to retain it better. There seems to be a link between actions and language. It seems to embed with movement. So I would always choose activities where, they're practicing this kind of small number of vocabulary within certain language patterns, but drilling in kind of different voices, using kind of different volumes. So my hand is like a volumizer. If my hand's in the middle, we're just going to say it normally. If my hand's at the top, we're going to say it loudly. If it's at the bottom, we're going to say it quietly. And also, with the voices, you can be creative. I'm going to do it in a llais hapus, a happy voice, a llais trist, a sad voice. I'm going to do it fel robot. And a robot is quite a handy one, actually, because a robot tends to chunk it up a little bit as well. Faint o gloch yw hi. So what time is it? But you can stomp out vocabulary and stomp out language patterns, or clap them out. So, for example, ble wyt ti'n byw? Ble wyt ti'n byw? So that's quite a useful thing as well to do. But just simple things like we talked about images. Well, we talked about images, didn't we, Jasmine? Just spinning a flashcard quite quickly in the air and seeing if the children can guess this particular word that we have drilled. Or basically you could do some mimes. So, for example, with the younger children, for example, we talked about songs. So I would be singing, sit my tywydd heddiw, sit my tywydd heddiw, sit my tywydd heddiw. And they would be singing that with me, and that's introducing them as well to the question within the song. So we'd have drilled the question, then we sing it in the song. They do a little mime. It could be bwrw glaw for raining. And then we all sing, mae hi'n bwrw glaw, bwrw glaw, bwrw glaw. So it's the fact that, you're giving the sentence as well and the question, and it does help the children retain it. I have done kind of oracy assessments with children where I ask them the question, oh, what's the word for what's the weather? And they can't remember it until you start humming the tune. And once you hum the tune, sit my tywydd heddiw. So it does help quite a lot in kind of retention.
That's interesting then. So there's that link between rhythm and meaning is obviously still key. So the rhythm becomes like a sort of facilitates memorization, but then it's still obviously really important to link it back to meaning and context, as you said before. I know all of this would be real kind of music to our colleague Marina's ears as well. She presented to a class that we're working with today, and one of the things that she was talking about was some of the different natural rhythms in different languages. So the sort of iambic pentameter being that sort of natural rhythm for English, but not so much for a Romance language like French. And she used nursery rhymes to sort of illustrate that, where a nursery rhyme or a children's song like The Grand Old Duke of York follows that iambic pentameter rhythm. So that idea of sort of language as performance is something that we're tapping into when we're establishing new vocab. Yeah, interesting. So can I just come back to that sort of wider context that you mentioned, Amanda? So we've talked a little bit about single words and how we might introduce single words, chunking. And actually there's some brilliant resources in the Words Matter playlist on the CSC website. Use of the Freya model, use of the define and apply model, use of morphology, as you said, kind of chunking words up. But more broadly, we do want learners to be able to apply that language in wider sentences and, as you said, in context. Any tips, again, any suggestions for building that understanding of new vocab within the context of sentence level or conversations as a whole?
Well, I think the learning intention of a lesson will really inform the language content and targeted skills. So therefore, the key vocabulary and language patterns within a context or topic need to be chosen really appropriately. And then the next step is to choose the suitable pedagogy and activities that you're going to use. So this is important as we want to plan for what should be learned. There's really limited value in giving learners just words and vocab in isolation, or even worse, just playing a game without a clear focus on the language. Mm-hmm. So drilling is the first stage in the process of language acquisition, but then we need to use that vocabulary within the context of relevant language patterns to meet the objectives of the lesson. I could give you an example if you'd like. Yeah. So for example, if we think about the process of drilling and the language game that we're going to use in order to practice this particular vocabulary and targeted language pattern, our learning intention could be that we're going to be talking about the past tense in the first person. And so we would introduce the relevant language pattern through a drill. SCE, I went to, or SCR, I went to the. And we would even clap it out to make sure that the children could hear the rhythm of it. It's quite an easy language pattern. I went to, SCE, SCR. So we would introduce that with the relevant vocabulary for the different countries. And again, we're looking at no more than 6 to 8. Because pupils find it easy to retain chunks of language, we would kind of introduce this vocabulary within a sentence pattern, and this would help the working memory of the learners as well. So I say, you say, SCE Sbaen, SCE Ffrainc, SCE Loegr, SCE Alban, SCE Eidal. And so they're listening and repeating, and it's a choral repetition. We're practicing in rows, groups, with individuals. We correct any mispronunciation in a positive manner, and then we repeat as a class rather than picking on individuals. So the learners could then practice those sentences in a game, a language game, and the language game could be finger splat. So this will further drill the vocabulary and sentence patterns. So you could have a group of 3, and what they're doing is drilling and testing each other with the language. So one of them would be the caller. There's a splat board with the sentences on in a grid, and the caller calls out the sentence. The other 2 have to compete to find the correct sentence, and when they find the sentence, they have to repeat it correctly, and the caller is there to check that they do so, and also give them a little bit of praise. Bendigedig, da iawn. Whoever gives the correct sentence first, they become the caller, and then they have to say the sentence, and the other 2 have to compete. The teacher can then check the learning by walking around and observing this activity and just kind of monitoring and supporting the pupils. They can also check the learning further by asking questions such as, well, beth ydy, what is es Alban? Beth ydy, what is I went to France, as a follow-up. So the learning would then move on to introducing the question. The question would be, ble est ti ar wyliau? Again, we use drilling techniques. One of these could be either volume or speed. The teacher could ask the question. The learners are now confident with the language pattern, es and so basically the new learning would be then to get the pupils to maybe ask the question to the teacher, and then pupil to pupil. You could also have a demonstration in front of peers. You could choose, again, 2 confident children to have a go of modelling this. And what this does, it shows good practice, the expectation of how we want the question to be asked, how we want it to be answered. And then you could even do a card game where you give pupils a different card with different countries on. They're asking each other now the question in a kind of whole class activity. Ble est ti ar wyliau? Whatever country is on the card of their partner, they would say SE, and then whatever the country is. And then they would ask their partner, ble est ti? And they would say, oh, SE Frank. They swap cards. So they're each asking and answering the questions, and it's repetitive, and they're getting different vocabulary each time because there's different countries. So that is one way that I would give it. That's a snapshot really of how I would start a lesson. But obviously planning is crucial, because what you've got to try and bear in mind with your planning is you're trying to embed and then progressively build on the language patterns during the lesson. And what you need to do is prepare the activities and the games that are going to fit in with your objectives, but also try and avoid cognitive overload. Don't introduce too much at once, because they won't retain it. So that's one way that I would do it. But obviously what you've got to bear in mind is that kind of key message, which is everybody speaks Welsh. So when you're choosing a game or activity, we want everybody to be involved. And there are some language games that, you know, that lead into that quite nicely, like Chain Reaction and Budge. But there are other games like Splat, which you might have to adapt, which is why I did the boards and the finger splat example. The pitfalls with all language games, and this includes Splat, is that if you haven't drilled the language, if you haven't shown the expectation of how you want the pupils to answer, they will find it very difficult. So you need to make sure that the game is going to support this, that the children know what the learning intention is, and that you are monitoring how the pupils are progressing during the games and activities. And if there are any misconceptions, you need to stop them, and you need then to, rectify that as a class. And then at the end, have a plenary. So you could have, again, pupils demonstrating, or it could be the 3, 4, 5 technique, where you find somebody, you find 4 people. So you choose 3 things that you have learnt, find 4 people that you can tell, what you've learnt to, and then you do that within 5 minutes. So it's kind of trying to embed what they've learnt.
Lovely. That's really helpful. I think especially some of those things that you pick up on as potential pitfalls that you know we do come across, and they're easy to sort of fall into. Perhaps, you know, just having one or two learners engaged with particular activities or particular games. So really thinking about how you're going to build that ratio, how, as you say, everyone is speaking Welsh, and then also that point about the game not being the end in itself, so that the language acquisition is really at the heart of everything that we do. Yeah, Jasmine, did you want to come in?
I was listening so intently. I've made so many notes when you were speaking then, Amanda. Thank you. I just wanted to circle back, if possible, to at the beginning there, where you were talking about, you know, teaching the vocabulary in context. I think that's so key, and actually sometimes overlooked, possibly, in English classrooms. So I was just thinking of some of the things we could do, like possibly teaching the related parts of speech as well. So, you know, if there's a noun, or if you're teaching an adjective, if there's an adverb, so that they can really have ownership and use that in whatever context they need to in a particular sentence. And it reminds me of when we use a bullseye in English quite a lot. So we'll have sort of a bullseye on the board with perhaps the 5 new words, and ask them to talk about the character and use those 5 words sort of in sentences and in a discussion with a partner. And then it got me thinking, when you said about really making sure that there are no misconceptions and that those words are being used incorrectly, about the power of trios and talk trios, whereby 2 learners could be having the discussion and using the bullseye and trying to use the words in context. And then the 3rd person could be sort of the silent observer, the checker, to check that they are using those words and perhaps pull them up in a friendly way if they've used one incorrectly. So yeah, a lot of food for thought there about teaching words in context, because there's no point teaching a word if they can't use it, is there? And that's probably true across the curriculum as well, actually. If you're teaching Tier 3 vocabulary in science, you need to show them, don't you, how they can use that, or even where they may come across that word in an exam question. So yeah, I've written down so much. Thank you.
If I can reinforce that as well. We had a really interesting example of vocab in context this morning, actually. So doing some work on progression planning with the cluster that we're supporting this morning. So we were looking at Oracy, and we were looking at gradual progression in terms of sophistication and difficulty. And we were looking at the idea that lots of our learners find it difficult to interrupt and know how to interrupt. So, you know, in discussions, very often you get learners just saying, well, I agree, because it sounds polite, and then actually not agreeing whatsoever. So we were talking about actually specifically teaching some of the key vocab, like, for example, the word interject. So teaching learners that the word interject and its application, its meaning in a discussion context. And, you know, for example, getting them to think about, well, why would it be rude to interject somebody giving a prepared speech in comparison to interjecting during a discussion? So actually, you know, getting learners to apply new vocab in a really meaningful context, because in that case, what we're going to ask them to do is to have a discussion and to have the confidence to interject, to challenge those things that we know that learners find really difficult to do, which again, I think probably goes back to, you know, that key point you made, Amanda, about identifying your learning intentions rather than sort of plucking nice sounding words out of the air, making sure that they've got application, making sure they've got a meaningful context. And a phrase that I've learned from the Cymraeg team and the languages team is that idea of a high surrender value. So vocabulary and new terms that have got application in several different areas, rather than just being extremely marginal or very sort of niche new vocab. So I think that was my last takeaway from work today, was that importance of language in context and vocab in context. Did you want to add any kind of final thoughts or nuggets of wisdom? We've covered an awful lot of ground. Any sort of final thoughts to conclude?
Well, I think it just finishes really with the importance of the drilling and making sure that you have your learning intention and you've planned what activities you do in connection with that, but making it fun. If it's fun and positive, then the children will want to do it. So that's it really from me.
Diolch am wrando ar y benod hon o Sgwrs. Cofiwch ein dilyn ar Twitter a Facebook, tanysgrifio ein sianel YouTube, ymuno yn cymunedau ar ein gwefan a darllen ein bwletin ysgolion wythnosol am y newyddion diweddaraf. Thanks for listening to this episode of Sgwrs. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, join our online communities via our website, and read our weekly school bulletin for the latest news. Hwyl am y tro. Bye for now.